sense
Yeah.
that theology
Yeah.
and philosophy might help integrate whatever the areas that folks choose to study. And there's no sense that we are training folks for their own Christian
Life.
vocation.
Yeah.
We're training them to be a good accountant, or we're training them to, go get a pre-med degree and go on to med school, etc.
Right.
But here is where the failure, and here's the challenge, I think, that every Christian institution will face going forward, because the overall trends in American higher education are deeply antithetical to Christian belief. So critical theory and all the focus on a variety of these sort of postmodern issues eat away at the idea that we are called by the Lord to live out. We want to work our minds. We've been given minds by God. They're a gift. How to use our minds in service of God and the world. I'm all with Father Hesburgh. We are to serve in the world, but we are not to sell our souls to the world.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. My name is Anthony Costello, and today I have the double privilege of being able to interview not only an excellent historian and scholar from the University of Notre Dame, Father Bill Miscamble, but also a family friend, a good friend of my father's and our families for many years now. So Father Bill, welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to have you today.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Good to be with you. Look forward to our conversation.
And it's going to be, I think, a very edifying one for our audience. Let me give a little introduction, Father Bill, because probably most of our audience won't be familiar with you yet, but that's also something we're hoping to introduce everybody to your work. So Father Bill Miscamble is a priest in the Congregation of the Holy Cross, which is the founding congregation of the University of Notre Dame. He joined the permanent faculty at the History Department of the university in 1988. He is from Australia originally, as you will soon hear from the accent. Educated at the University of Queensland and at Notre Dame. He received his doctoral degree in 1980 and served for 2 years as the North American Analyst in the Office of National Assessments, the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra, Australia. In August of 1982, he returned to Notre Dame and entered the priestly formation program of the Congregation of Holy Cross and was ordained a priest on April 9th, 1988. He chaired the history department at Notre Dame from 1993 to 98, the years that I was there. In addition to his responsibilities on the history faculty, he served from 2000 to 2004 as the rector and superior of Moreau Seminary, which is the principal formation site for the Congregation of the Holy Cross in North America. Father Bill's primary research interests are American foreign policy since World War II and the role of Catholics in 20th century U.S. public life. So, and that latter interest is really what we're talking about today, where we're going to take a look a little bit at this book, which is the biography of Father Theodore Hesburgh, somebody, again, that may not be entirely familiar to our audience, unless people are in Christian higher education, probably know Father Hesburgh's legacy at Notre Dame, president for 35 years there, from 1952 to 87. Father Bill, is that right?
That's right.
And, as I was reading through the book, Father Bill, I tell you, it's one of those stories. I mean, here's a man who kind of did it all, right? I mean, it's hard to sort of wrap your mind around everything that Father Hesburgh was involved in, the people that he met in his life, the influence that he had, the international reach that he had, both sort of in the political and secular world, but also his in the Vatican, in the ecclesial world as well. And I was trying to think for our audience, like, who might be somebody comparable in the Protestant world in the 20th century? And of course, the only name I could think of was Billy Graham, who had this kind of like these kind of connections, the international sort of popularity as a minister. Of course, Billy Graham wasn't really attached to an institution the way Father Hesburgh was. And you do mention at the end of the book that Hesburgh was not as much of sort of maybe a sort of a spiritual or moral guide to the people, the politicians he was in, but he was really more involved in a lot of these political decisions.
Yes.
I mean, there's the numerous committees and commissions he was on. So maybe just give us sort of, in your words, an overview of the man, Theodore Hesburgh, and how influential and important a figure he was in the 20th century.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Anthony. And as I say, it's very good to be with you here. And there's no doubt that if your listeners had heard the name Father Hesburgh back in the 1970s, 1980s, he would have been a much more familiar name. But as with most things, you know, as time passes, people become less and less familiar with past figures. But he certainly was among the most influential Catholic priests of that sort of mid-20th century period, from the 50s through to the 1980s. He was born in Syracuse, New York, came to Notre Dame as an undergraduate and entered the seminary, was ordained in 1943, stayed on at Catholic University of America and did a doctorate there. And so he was sort of trained as a theologian, but very quickly his abilities, his leadership, his administrative capabilities were recognized, and he was drawn into administration at Notre Dame. He served a brief period, 3 years as executive vice president, and then at the age of 35, he is made president of the university, and as you mentioned earlier, served for 35 years. He served until 1987, and he lived a long life. He lived until his mid-90s. I suspect if he knew he was going to live that long, he might have stayed on for another 5 years, because he loved leading Notre Dame and saw it as his great life's ambition to create, as he would say, a great Catholic university. But even though that was his central ambition to build up this university, he always saw himself as also involved in activities beyond the university. And in fact, indicative of his sort of remarkable stamina and energy, there was nothing he loved more than getting on a plane and flying off for some meeting, a commission or a group or something. Early on in the in his sort of leadership of Notre Dame, I think it was in 1957, he was appointed as the Vatican's delegate to the International Atomic Energy Commission. And so for about 12 or 15 years, he would go off to Vienna each sort of fall for these meetings and then report in Rome. So he has those church connections that you mentioned. But more significant, he is drawn into the National Science Foundation, and then in 1957, Eisenhower appoints him to the Civil Rights Commission. So he is involved in this great moral political issue right at the time when it is becoming the sort of central domestic question for the United States in the late 50s through the 60s. So he serves on the Civil Rights Commission for Eisenhower, for Kennedy, for Johnson, for Nixon. Nixon eventually dismisses him from his role as chair. Later on, he's involved in a variety of other presidential appointments and issues like nuclear arms control, immigration, and so on. So he's involved in all these, what we might call sort of secular political issues. He would have said always that he had a sort of a moral dimension that he tried to bring to these issues. But your earlier point, Anthony, about a distinction between Father Ted and, say, a remarkable figure like Billy Graham, Father Ted was almost like an inside player, committee meetings and commissions and so on. People were aware of him. His face was on the cover of Time magazine once, but he wasn't an enormous public presence like Billy Graham with the Great Crusades and things of that sort, nor was he a spiritual advisor to presidents in the way that Billy Graham was for Lyndon Johnson, for Richard Nixon, and some subsequent presidents as well. Graham was both a remarkable sort of external presence because of his ministry, and also a internal spiritual advisor and counselor to presidents. Father Ted was more, he was on the Civil Rights Commission. He was trying to get justice for African Americans, etc. That was the kind of role that he played. But he always kept Notre Dame, there were temptations put before him to take up other positions, but he declined.
Yes.
He always wanted to retain the presidency of Notre Dame because that was his central, if you will, ambition to build up Notre Dame. And of course, by every material measure, Anthony, by every material measure, numbers of students, numbers of buildings on campus, size of endowment, and so on, he does a remarkable job.
Only success in that domain, right?
Building up this university and improving its reputation, et cetera, et cetera. So Father Hesburgh titled his autobiography, God, Country, Notre Dame. And he saw himself as contributing in this. God was his church work, country, of course, his work for the United States, and Notre Dame, of course, for the university. And I think, his life was integrated. All these parts sort of held together in a way and somehow or other influenced each other. But I do see him as his role as a churchman, his role as a public servant, his role as a university leader. And obviously we might want to talk most about his role as leading this university and trying to build it up here today. But I hope that your listeners will appreciate that he had these very other significant roles as well. And the fact that he was able to do them all and with the energy he did is, a testament to his remarkable energy.
Well, yeah, it's an amazing, and again, it reads like kind of a sweeping, almost like one of these classical Hollywood films, epic, sort of a historical epic. And of course, I commend I'm always in awe anytime I read a historical work like this, just with the amount of detail that you are able to keep track of. I can't imagine the number of notes that are scattered all over your office, but it's amazing to read the book as well, because it's almost like there's no domain of culture or society that he wasn't somehow tied to or involved in. I think in the book you even mentioned at one point somebody sort of indirectly suggested that he run, I don't know if it was with Carter.
Vice president.
Vice president for Carter, I think, right?
No. It was of all things for the ill-fated McGovern campaign.
Oh, McGovern, the George McGovern, yeah.
1972, and his name was being fished around as a possibility. Right. Of course, McGovern had all kinds of troubles.
Sure.
His first selection for vice president had to retire, and eventually Sergeant Shriver ran on the ticket.
Who was one of Father Hesburgh's close
friends. Great regard for Sergeant Shriver. Yeah, I think Father Hesburgh had something of I know your listeners, Anthony, may be wondering, why are we talking about a Catholic priest, etc.? Right. But to track his story is to track something of the challenges of retaining sort of fidelity in the church
Mm-hmm.
through from the 1950s onwards in the United States. And Father Hesburgh wanted the church to be engaged with the world. You know, he
Right.
believed that the church had something to contribute in the world. And he thought that the university had an important part to sort of serve the world and to address some of these great issues and social and political problems, so on. When he started off in the 1950s, I think he was more of a centrist
Mm-hmm.
politically.
Right.
You know, he admired Eisenhower greatly, etc. But through the course of the 60s, a decade that I'm sure your listeners appreciate, had such an impact on American culture, he was pulled more and more in a more liberal direction. And the latter part of his life, the 70s and 80s, while he always proclaimed himself politically independent, he did not
Yeah.
identify with either party. Nonetheless, he was moving more and more in a liberal direction. And in the 1980s, he devoted a lot of his time and energy to nuclear arms control, to the nuclear freeze movement and so on. He was something of a critic of the Reagan administration. And of course, by the end of the decade, when Reagan was meeting with Gorbachev and they were lowering the temperature in the Cold War and signing the Intermediate Nuclear Range treaty, etc., Father Ted had to sort of grudgingly concede that Reagan perhaps had made some progress with his
More
approach,
tough-minded approach. Yeah.
which was build up, you know, your defenses first and then be willing to negotiate. But anyway,
right. Well, let's actually go off the script a little bit, because you mentioned a couple things there. I mean, this is the sort of dynamic that Father Hesburgh was sort of the concrete embodiment of this dynamic of how to stay faithful to the original and first call of the church, the call of Christ, to be salt and light in the world, but then actually being on the in the city of man, so to say, and trying to do that. You know, and you quote him towards the end, I think, out of God, Country, Notre Dame, where he said he was always on the outskirts of Christianity, dealing with all of these, you know, either other co-religionists, Muslims, Jew. I mean, he had to deal with all kinds of other faiths, but then just also the secular-minded in the West, people who were in the positions of leadership and power. So, I mean, let's take that kind of dynamic, because you also point out in the book that, I mean, his personal life, I mean, this was a devoted priest. I mean, this was a devoted priest of the Catholic Church. His Catholic practice was, he was very fervent and dedicated to the practices of his faith, be it saying Mass on a regular basis, his, of course, for the Roman Catholic priest, his devotion to Mary as well. And he's not really a theological liberal. I mean, this is not somebody who denied the divinity of Christ or questioned the creeds or anything. But in spite of that sort of more traditional theological conservatism, we do see his social and political life moving more and more liberal as the decades progressed. So maybe go into, like, with regards to his role as president then of the university, how does maybe some of those compromises play out at Notre Dame itself?
This is a theme, Anthony, that I try to address in a certain sense throughout the book. And if any of your listeners are willing to pick up the book, they will see that sort of theme worked out in a range of issues. So I'll give a little background so he becomes president in 1952, and he has this vision of building a great Catholic university. He recognizes that Notre Dame is of modest size, that it's primarily an undergraduate institution at this time.
With a
and
popular football team.
with a great football team, that it's a well-known place because of the athletics.
Right.
And it has a certain attraction to folks also because of the religiosity of the place. But he looks and he can see that the major universities, the Ivy Leagues, the leading state schools like Berkeley and University of Michigan and so on, that what wins them regard and respect is research, major graduate programs, etc. So he knows he has an enormous task on hand, that he will have to build up the academic quality of his institution. Now, when he starts off in the 1950s, and I sort of detail this in a chapter that covers his first 6-year term as president, he very consciously says, we have to have our Catholic mission and identity as central to the enterprise. We have to keep that at the heart. So we're going to be a great university, but very much a great Catholic university. As the 50s move along, there are a number of challenges that come to that view. There's a kind of crisis of confidence among Catholics about the mediocrity, was the word bandied about, of their institutions. A great Catholic historian, John Tracy Ellis, he writes a big essay that has a sort of enormous ripple effects through Catholic higher education. They're all mainly these relatively small teaching universities. They're not big research institutions. And Ellis says, why aren't they better than they are? That kind of thing. So that only is of greater concern for Hesburgh. Oh, I've got to keep moving here. Right at that time, he's being drawn into a number of appointments. He's appointed to the National Science Foundation. Next thing, he's palling around with all these scientists who are at all the great universities, Berkeley and so on. Also, he is asked by the Rockefellers to join the so-called Special Studies Project. And Father Hesburgh begins to be drawn into the web, I call it the web, of the Rockefeller Foundation and all of their programs. And they're studying education and issues of that sort. So that brings him into a circle of leading social scientists and figures, etc. And so he begins to move outwards from what some might have seen as an overly Catholic perspective. And he's recognizing, wow, we've got to do better in science, we've got to do better here, etc. All of that to say there's increasingly assimilationist pressures to conform the school more to what has been termed, some of your listeners would appreciate, the so-called Harvard-Berkeley model. David Reisman wrote a book on education, I think it was Reisman, refers to Harvard-Berkeley. Everyone's sort of modeling themselves on what's done there.
Right.
And of course, what are those models? Harvard's the model that has given up any serious consideration. They still have the divinity school, but within the university writ large, religion plays no real role. And of course, Berkeley is a state campus to begin with. So that's increasingly the model that he draws from. So that's sort of moving along. We've got to get respect. We've got to kind of conform ourselves to being more like them so that they will regard us more highly, is the sort of logic. But right at this time, in the early 60s, there's one of the most sort of significant events for the Catholic Church. The Second Vatican Council is held in Rome from 1962 to 1965. And so the council, which, has come in for all kinds of commentary, but one thing is for sure in its document, Gaudium et Spes, how the church should relate to the modern world, it's saying you've got to reach out, you've got to engage the world. And so Father Hesburgh says, this is confirming exactly what I thought we should be doing.
Right.
We've got to get out there. We've got to engage the world, et cetera, et cetera.
Recontextualize,
Exactly.
for the modern day, right?
So,
For the modern man.
in that process, so there are multiple things going on. In that process, however, there's the hiring of people essentially just to fill an academic slot. You're going to teach biology, as opposed to hiring with overall mission in mind. And so the project becomes slightly more, how do we get academic credibility? Father Hesburgh is concerned about this matter of academic credibility. Now, some of your listeners may not be as familiar with the sort of structure of the Catholic Church, but at the time, at this point in the 60s, Notre Dame still was part of this hierarchical church.
Under the auspices of Rome.
Yeah, so
and the Holy Cross congregation.
Chain of command, but it's particular the Holy Cross congregation.
Right.
But the superior general of the Holy Cross congregation is in Rome, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Hesburgh strains under these, restraints. And he says, look, we can't get respect and credibility if we're having these sort of outside groups tell us what to do. And so jump ahead. I'm covering a lot here, but it makes sense to your listeners if they read the book. But jump ahead, 1967, the famous Land O'Lakes Statement.
Right.
Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin. Father Hesburgh's up there with a bunch of Catholic educators. They sign this statement in which they essentially say, look, we're not going to have any external authorities govern us in any way, shape, or form. Now, he didn't mean the NCAA, which tells every university how to organize all their athletics. He didn't mean the North Central Association that's got to accredit our programs. He meant the church. We don't want
the magisterium of the church.
And one historian, a former teacher of mine, a great historian, Philip Gleason, has sort of referred to it as implicitly a declaration of independence from external church authority. Now, maybe there are these issues that occur for some evangelical institutions, questions about who you report to, et cetera, et cetera. But that seemed to symbolize this movement into becoming more and more a modern American university seeking excellence. Now, Father Ted always wanted it to be a Catholic university, but there's the tension, you see.
And right. And that okay, so we got a lot. You just explained quite several threads that keep popping up throughout the book as one goes through all of the concrete events of his life and the interactions. But two of those threads that you just talked about, one is, we're in a post-World War II era.
Yeah.
There's sort of what I might call like a hopeful modernism, right?
Absolutely.
All of the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, there's this idea of we can sort of integrate a version of Catholicism into this modern vision. Right. Which, of course, that's what Vatican II is trying to do without retaining or without losing, right, the fixed and moral content of the Bible, the tradition of the church, the role of the magisterium. But when we start talking about the United States, post-World War II United States, that hopeful modernism starts to detach itself from a more, what I'd say, biblically grounded or theologically serious kind of Roman Catholicism or evangelicalism as well, maybe. And then there's that tension. But there was this sense, I think, and it's throughout the book, that people like Father Hesburgh and many of the people that he surrounded himself with kind of had this belief, if you just put the right people in the room together,
Yeah.
right? If we just put all of the best and brightest in the room together, we can tackle poverty, immigration,
Yeah.
civil rights. Like, we can get this done. So, and then one, as a historian, you want to look back and sort of adjudicate that. But there is sort of this maybe one, I'll bring it down to more of bring it to a theological, like, is there a sort of a pride here in what man can actually do in his own capacities? So maybe that's also one way to present this tension of this sort of like, we can do it, and sort of the idea of God actually interacting directly in history, and that greater dependence and need to submit everything we do to divine providence. That sort of gets pushed away a little bit. That gets pushed into the background in this sort of new humanism. Would that be like sort of a fair kind of portrayal?
Yes. Yeah, I think Father Ted, well, as you mentioned earlier, Anthony, he says mass every
Yeah.
day.
Personally, he's
Says his
not
prayers
personally,
and
but
so on.
right.
He gets drawn in. He
Yeah.
gets drawn in to this somewhat utilitarian.
Progressive
If
kind
we
of.
just get the right people, we'll have a blue ribbon commission and we can come up with the answers. This is symbolized, as you mentioned, by the Rockefellers, somewhat by the Kennedy administration. I mean,
Mhm.
JFK is, on paper, the first Catholic president, but there's no great indication that he's influenced by his deep Catholic beliefs or whatever.
Right.
No, he wants to recruit the best and the brightest who will come together. Of course, David Halberstam used the best and the brightest as the title for his book about how all these highly able, wonderfully brilliant people got the United States more and more deeply involved in Vietnam. So there's an
Right.
irony.
It's a term that I'm reading one of Thomas Sowell's book right now, Conflict of Visions.
Okay.
And he also lays out, he goes back obviously as far as Rousseau, and sort of the progressives of the late 17th and 18th and 19th century. And he also uses, I think, the term, there's this idea of, for progressives, that sort of don't believe in a constrained human nature, a human nature
Yeah,
constrained
they'll
by
be able
sin and
somehow or
finitude,
other.
right? That the best and the
Exactly.
brightest will actually be able to figure this all out for us, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And of course, the 60s, by the end of the decade, most folks are conceding the best and the brightest have not succeeded in their endeavors. Yet Father Hesburgh never loses that sort of sense of optimism, that idea that if you just can get good people together, they'll come up with a solution, etc. And that was certainly characteristic of him right through his life. I suggest in my book that maybe a bit of a dose of that Reinhold Niebuhr's
Yes, you did.
realism, that
Right.
sort of recognition that there is evil in the
Yeah.
world and there are some problems that are difficult. We need to turn to the Lord for guidance because we can't solve
Yeah.
everything. It's not just a utilitarian calculation.
Calculus.
We get
Right.
the right things together and it'll all come out right. No, the issues we confront are deeper than that.
Yeah. And I highlighted the one or two of the, I think twice you mentioned Niebuhr, 2 or 3 times you mentioned Niebuhr. And, that seemed to also maybe come into play with Hesburgh's, not conflict with Reagan, but where there wasn't the same kind of engagement with the Reagan administration as with some of the previous administrations, like a Carter administration that was maybe much more hopeful about humanity. And, but that didn't turn into a very good realpolitik, where Reagan's more conservative view about maybe the nature of man and what man was not only capable of doing, but also incapable of doing, right? Where maybe Hesburgh's optimism sort of and Reagan's, I don't want to call it Reagan's pessimism, because I think everybody felt Reagan was an optimist of sorts as well, but that Reagan realism sort of didn't jive very well.
I think that's exactly right. And I tried to go into that. Ironically, Hesburgh is on hand to try and assist Carter during the 1976 election. Some Catholics, and for that matter, those of limited religious conviction, were concerned about Carter's evangelical Protestantism.
Right.
Father Ted liked Carter and did his best to assist Carter during the campaign. He liked Jerry Ford as a person, but he felt much more comfortable with what he hoped Carter's policies would be. And Carter made him this ambassador to this great UN conference, etc., which was exactly what you're talking about, Anthony. All these progressive ideas were going to be thrown into the melting pot, and it turned into a sort of a semi-chaotic occasion. And meanwhile, poor Carter was into more and more difficulties in his administration. And while Father Ted still had regard for him, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter came to Notre Dame for the memorial service we had for Father Hesburgh. Their affection for him continued on. Nonetheless, Father Ted himself could see by 1980 that Carter was probably in a bit over his head. So anyway, that's a different area, I know, than we want to discuss.
Well, this is all good. I really hope, and of course we'll post links to the book so that people can take a look. Again, this is Father Hesburgh's story. Really is, again, it's almost like reading the book was almost like watching the movie Forrest Gump, in a sense, because he goes through these decades, these formative decades, right, in American politics and social life. Everything from, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, then Vietnam, then the Cold War and the nuclear drawdown, and just so many things that he was involved in, and all the while in and out of the Vatican as well, and trying to relate to whoever the new pontiff is. And you also point out in the book how he was much closer to some than others.
Yes, he's very close to Pope Paul VI.
Right.
He has limited contact with Pope Pius XII and then Pope John the 23rd. But Paul VI, it really is a genuine friendship.
Right. They know each other. Close
connection, but gets ruptured over the birth control issue. And then Father Ted's sort of on the outs for a time. And then when eventually John Paul II comes in, Father Ted's connection with you call him JP2, Pope John Paul II, is a bit like with the Reagan administration, Anthony. He can't quite connect with Reagan, and he can't quite connect with JP2 because his own sort of liberal convictions by that point are sort of reigning within him, and he sees John Paul II as this tough-minded Pole who's standing up against the Soviet Union. And Father Ted was very much into détente and negotiations and dialogue and all those words, which
just get the right people in the room. And
if we can just sit down, we can settle anything. JP2 was like, I lived in Poland under the communists for 25 years. I know what dialogue is. I know what dialogue means to them, that kind of thing.
Well, and I tell you what, Father Bill, aren't we going through the same thing today as well, where you have voices on the one hand who feel like, if we just continued the dialogue, we will be able to work this out. But, we see where we're going politically, now a few decade, 2 decades, 3 decades after Father Hesburgh sort of went into his retirement and everything. And we feel like things are getting where the dialogue's breaking down, and the move towards a more just like batten down the hatches.
Yeah.
and let's enough of this dialogue. And so while you were mentioning Rod Dreher's book earlier, right?
Yeah.
And I haven't read the book yet, his latest one, but
Live Not by Lies.
yeah, there is this sense of where have the best and the brightest actually led us? Where has that hopeful modernism taken us to? So how about, let me ask you this. Let's get down. Yeah, go ahead.
More from the perspective of where has the modern university, the modern college,
right,
gone in this? You're talking about and Rod Dreher is talking about a much larger
right
context.
So let's talk about the educational formation of the country.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the example of a sort of secularizing trend has been part of the story of higher education from the time of the 19th century, with Harvard and Yale and so forth giving up any significant role for religion. And then my colleague here at Notre Dame for quite a number of years, a great historian named George Marsden. I'm sure some of your listeners would be familiar with his books on evangelicalism and his great biography of Jonathan Edwards, just a remarkable book.
Yeah, he was just out here a few years ago at Biola and speaking on Jonathan Edwards. So
George wrote a book called The Soul of the American University, and he tracks what he calls the de-Christianization of a lot of the sort of this next generation of schools. They're all, great schools now, Duke and Vanderbilt and Emory and schools of that sort, who give up on their Christian identity and their formal connection with a church, with their denomination. And then my own confrere in Holy Cross, James Birchall, wrote a book called The Dying of the Light. It might be of interest to some of your listeners. He did some case studies of a whole range of schools.
Now, this is the James Birchall who was also provost back in the 70s.
He surfaces in my book, but this is after he was forced out as provost and so forth. He wrote this book. So those are books that would give your listeners more details of the story. So this process of secularizing or de-Christianizing has been an ongoing one. And so the question that has been faced by Hesburgh and places like Notre Dame are, as you modernize and as you want to improve your academic excellence, are you putting at risk your religious identity, your religious commitments? Here's the great challenge. Can you retain your deep conviction, your mission as a Catholic school, and advance yourself in terms of academic quality and so on? And this has been the great challenge that I think a whole range of Catholic schools have had exceptional difficulty with over the last 30 to 40 years. Certainly, I would put Notre Dame in that category, but, Georgetown, Fordham, Boston College, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the issue that was already appearing on the scene for Father Hesburgh from the 70s into the 80s. It was becoming an issue, and then it has bubbled up more as an issue. I like to say that at Notre Dame, it is still an issue. We are still arguing over what it means to be a Catholic university. In some places, I fear, sadly, I take no pleasure in this, sadly, the battle is almost lost. But here, there is still a concern about it. But Father Ted's concern for academic excellence and the practice of pretty much hiring in the normal manner of, our preferred peers, which are all secular schools, hiring in the same manner, puts at risk the religious nature of the school. So
it's almost
an issue and a challenge that I've tried to wrestle with for 30 years here.
Well, and I wonder, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I was thinking about, here are the Catholic institutions in the 40s and 50s who are smaller institutions, liberal arts institutions,
Yeah,
probably just,
yeah,
in the philosophy and theology departments focused on Aquinas and the scholastics,
yes,
and that sort of training of the mind. And of course, but then there's the big push under Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame and certainly other presidents elsewhere to modernize,
yeah,
to get the Catholic University to the model of the American research institution.
yeah,
In a sense, it almost looks like a parallel of what happened 60, 70, 80 years prior with the
yeah,
Protestant institutions on the East Coast. And where then once maybe Princeton is sort of the last giant to fall, but then you have like an emergence of smaller evangelical Protestant schools like the ones that Dr. Moeller presides over,
yeah,
that try and retain the religious character and the
yeah,
biblical
yeah,
mission, the biblical commission
yeah,
of the various denominations that they may be attached to. Now we see even those smaller institutions struggling over their souls. That the battle, again, like you say, continues. Notre Dame as still a major, so has maybe, like you said earlier, under Father Hesburgh, did achieve the modern and the research
yeah,
part of the American institution that he was looking for. And the battle still kind of rages, though, on questions of the soul. And you bring up at the book several times, and maybe this was the biggest failure. And again, this was we're not trying to disparage Father Hesburgh as a man. I mean, this was a complex man living in complex times, commendable in many ways. But it seems like, I would say the two things. One is the break with the authority of the church that you
yeah,
mentioned earlier with the Land O'Lakes document and the independence from now. And maybe there was some good reasons to do that. You don't want to get bogged down with the bureaucracy of people who don't really understand how an American university is supposed to work. There are pragmatic reasons there, but maybe talk about what you think the long-term effects of that actual break from the ecclesial authorities in Rome. And then also you talk about it. What matters is who teaches and what is taught. So the
yes,
actual, maybe the lack of the spiritual formation piece in the classrooms
yeah,
at the university.
yeah. Well, I'll try and address the first matter, the sort of break with the ecclesial authority.
Mhm.
Now, I know this might seem it complicates matters for some of your listeners, the sort of complex arrangements of Catholicism. The fact that the Congregation of Holy Cross, my religious order, still had a continuing role at the university, and that the president of the university is required to be a Holy Cross priest, meant that there was still some indirect connection to the church. We wanted to see ourselves as sort of part of the church and not as distinct. And Hesburgh himself wanted to preserve what my colleague Fred Freddoso, who teaches or used to teach in philosophy, he called the Catholic neighborhood. So there was still a vibrant liturgical life. There was our
The
big
practice
church
was
on
there.
campus, Sacred Heart Basilica. There was a chapel in every dorm where students were called to pray, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Now, the quality can vary considerably. Anthony, you know that from your own experience.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, there was the Center for Social Concerns and calling on students to engage in Christian service. There were choirs, serving at all kinds of sort of external signs
Activity.
of religiosity. So Fred Freddoso refers to that as the Catholic neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
That's the neighborhood. But what is happening within the school? He means the academic center. The heart of a university is its academic heart. And there, sadly, much was drifting in a more conventional manner to replicate or imitate what was going on elsewhere. We still kept a theology department, but for a significant number of years, it was dominated by a sort of a liberal Catholic flavor. I think there's much less of that now, actually. Some very fine theologians here. But in the Hesburgh years, he recruited Father Richard McBrien to head the theology department, and that was the sort of flavor. So there wasn't any desire on the part of the theology department of the university to see itself as sort of supportive of and helpful, serving the church,
or the maintainer of the tradition either.
You keep a bit, you keep arm's length for fear that they might want to tell you what to do, in some way, which was overstated. The Catholic Church got enough problems trying to handle them without getting too involved in overseeing universities. So that remains a sort of, the bishop is always welcomed here for big liturgies and so on, but it's I would say, sort of like a standoff. Notre Dame doesn't want to be told what to do by any institutional church figure.
Right.
On the other hand, Notre Dame wants to constantly assert that it is indeed a Catholic university. And here is where I have said, then the demonstration of that comes down to two essential questions. What is taught and who teaches? And so unless you have a majority of faculty who have signed on, who are committed to the place being a distinct institution, they're not wanting a replication of Northwestern. They want Notre Dame to be a distinct Notre Dame. Unless you have a majority of faculty who are committed to that. This means whether they're in engineering or science or whatever. It's not just for theology and philosophy. It's not just for the humanities. This is across the board. Everyone brings their own contribution, seeing in some way that they're doing God's work in the world. It's like a vocation. You're living out your Christian vocation as a teacher, and then that's conveyed you don't even have to speak it. It's conveyed to the students. So I say to anyone listening who's in an evangelical institution, the hiring of faculty is a crucial question. But the reason why, faculty will ultimately determine what is taught. Now, Notre Dame used to have, this is going way back, something approaching a coherent, integrated curriculum. You take something that would build on something that would build on something. That, of course, as we know, is still done in the sciences and in engineering. You take engineering 101 before you take engineering 201. But no, the humanities, this goes for higher education writ large. It has been just divided up,
fragmented,
into a whole sort of complex of offerings. It's like a big buffet table.
Smorgasbord.
The students just come and they take a little bit from here and a little bit from there.
And theology is not necessarily the capstone of those humanities leading up to your sacred theology.
There's no sense that theology and philosophy might help integrate whatever the areas that folks choose to study. And there's no sense that we are training folks for their own Christian life vocation. We're training them to be a good accountant, or we're training them to, go get a pre-med degree and go on to med school, etc. But here is where the failure, and here's the challenge, I think, that every Christian institution will face going forward, because the overall trends in American higher education are deeply antithetical to Christian belief. So critical theory and all the focus on a variety of these sort of postmodern issues eat away at the idea that we are called by the Lord to live out. We want to work our minds. We've been given minds by God, they're a gift.
Right.
How to use our minds in service of God and the world. I'm all with Father Hesburgh. We are to serve in the world, but we are not to sell our souls to the world.
We're not to
We're
be
to
of
bring
the world.
Christ.
Right.
We're to bring Christ to the world. Now that's what Father Ted thought he was doing in a sense throughout his life. But I suggest, you know, your listeners should be aware, my book has come in for some criticism
Sure.
for being too critical of Father Hesburgh, who's an icon here.
Right.
At
Well,
Notre
and this
Dame.
is one of the things that I don't know if you said in the introduction, but I mean, there was a lot of hagiography about Father
Yeah.
Hesburgh, and at some
Yeah.
point, if we're going to be honest, as Christian thinkers and scholars, well, then we have to be honest with the facts of history, the reality of the human soul. We're complicated creatures. Father Ted was trying to walk a very fine line.
Yeah.
We shouldn't expect that he hovered over things, whether he's a saint or like some, as if he was untouched by the world either. And there was real compromises that were made. And I came into Notre Dame in '93 at the end of, I don't know if McBrien was still the head of the theology department at that time, but by the time I got there, I think I have to say honestly, looking back, that life on campus was like any other secular campus, and that would include the moral issues of the drinking, the sexual activity. I mean, those were just the realities. That's the way it was. Was there a chapel in every dorm? Sure. Did we go to midnight mass? Sure. But we were doing all kinds of other things as well that maybe weren't as edifying. So I think it was a mixed bag, right? I mean, it was a mixed bag. Different people have different experiences. Notre Dame certainly has produced people like Amy Coney Barrett, who is doing
now, of course,
exactly that. But,
Amy, of course, went to Rhodes College as an undergraduate and came to Notre Dame for law school.
Studies. Right.
So, wonderful, wonderful person.
Well, Father Bill, I know our time's getting short. I would love to talk to you about the very concrete moral issue that I think was and still is the dividing line, and that was extremely difficult for Father Ted, which was the issue of abortion, of course. And I know how deeply involved you've been with my parents as well on fighting that battle, both on Notre Dame and just in the culture more broadly. But for the sake of time, I'll just put it out there that that certainly was a dividing line issue, where Father Ted certainly never gave up his personal belief that abortion was sin and sinful, but did struggle with, just in virtue of all the relationships he had with people who were far more pro-choice, of course. And that was we'll just leave it for the audience to take a look at the book and try and understand that sort of perennial.
I think, Tony, if I could say just a couple of things.
Well, sure, please.
He was palling around. He's on the Rockefeller Foundation board. And what's one of the Rockefeller Foundation board's big projects? Population control.
Right.
And, he always voted against anything that was explicitly associated with abortion and so on. But I raised the question of how closely can you get caught in their tethers. So he never made the life issues one of his sort of signature issues, the way he did with nuclear arms control in the 1980s. And I suggest that in some ways this was a missed opportunity, because coming out of the civil rights movement, he did have some credibility, some prestige he could have brought to bear on that great moral issue that we still confront and face. I will say this. Mario Cuomo was the governor of New York, and he came to Notre Dame in 1984, and he gave a speech, which in many ways is a very sad speech, but it got a lot of attention because Cuomo said, look, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I can't do anything in the public sphere about it because there isn't a consensus on this issue. And Father Ted, to his great credit, wrote an op-ed soon afterwards. And of course, he has to do the usual throat clearing of, oh, it was a great speech and Cuomo's so terrific. But then he gets to his point and he says, but really, he's not right. He said, in the civil rights movement, there's a right and a wrong. And you have to stand on the right side and you have to put all your effort into building the moral consensus. And he said that's what Mario Cuomo should be doing instead of hiding behind the absence of a consensus and saying, I can't do anything about it. I'm just personally opposed. But, you know,
which
I
seems to also be,
well,
I don't even know if the current president would say that he's personally against it. I don't know if he would say that.
Well, sadly, the current president, Joe Biden, seems to have revised what was at least once a position where he expressed some moral reservations about abortion and said, I can't support the public funding of it. Now, of course, he backtracked during the campaign, and now he's favoring the overturn of the Hyde Amendment. It's quite sad, as a matter of fact, quite sad.
Well, it does seem to be where we've landed. We could, well, you know, we might have to do another interview. There's several more issues I'd love to.
Your poor listeners will be crying out, "Stop that Australian priest!"
No, there'll be more. You know, I'm supposed to say that. You know, maybe we'll have to get a thing of doers. Is it doers that I was supposed to mention? My father said.
I have occasionally consumed a little doers.
Send you a gift of doers to
no
compel you to do another interview with us. But let's finish up, because I'd like, as a historian, you know, putting on your historian's hat, which, well, it's already on, but what is your sense? You know, none of us fill the office of prophet here, but what is your sense of the future of Roman Catholic education? And maybe where have you seen some glimmers of hope? Maybe there are some other models out there, some other institutions that you'd like to point to as well that have really done a good job in this area of maintaining the tradition and presenting Christ through education.
Yeah. I don't want to give up on places like Notre Dame. As I said earlier, there's a battle going on here, and I encourage anyone who's working in higher education to do their bit wherever they are to build up Christian higher education. But I do think there are some interesting sort of cases where it might seem like we're losing out in certain institutions, but green shoots are coming up in other places. So you're out on the West Coast. You know, in the 1970s, a group of small Catholic liberal arts colleges began to grow up. I use the example of Thomas Aquinas up there heading towards Santa Barbara. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that has a very strong, academically rigorous Christendom College would be another one like that. There has been renewal in certain Catholic colleges. Franciscan University was almost on the verge of closing down. Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and it's had a real revival by focusing on mission and calling forth its students to live good moral lives. The University of Dallas would be another place that has retained a defined curriculum as to maybe what an educated Catholic should know. I think there are some lively Newman centers near the big state universities, the University of Nebraska or Purdue University. They have these, and they're offering courses. Texas A&M would be another one, Anthony, where they offer courses to try and help students, even though they're taking just regular classes at the institutions. These places on the edges of the big campuses can provide. There are also, I think, centers for sort of Catholic thought and reflection that have grown up. I don't know if you're familiar with the Lumen Christi Institute near the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
They get friendly faculty to make contributions. They've done some good works. And then there are active Catholics in some of the sort of think tanks. So Catholic ideas, Catholic thought in collaboration with other Christian thinking and so on is indeed going on. It's not going on as well as it should be in the Catholic universities and colleges, sadly, at the moment. But
and I'd
the
say
Lord will guide us forward. We have to keep our prayer going. And if it may be strange for some of your evangelical listeners, but if they would offer some prayers for our efforts here at Notre Dame, that this place retain its distinctive Catholic mission. We've had wonderful, I've had in the history department during my time, of course, I've been here now 35 years, George Marsden came to join us, and then George was replaced by Mark Knoll.
Mark Knoll, very well known.
Two wonderful scholars. They're
and of course, everybody in our audience will know Alvin Plantinga and his
Al
work
Plantinga
at Notre
was
Dame.
in the philosophy department, etc. John Van Ingen was in medieval studies and so on.
Yeah.
So they saw the possibilities of coming to this school precisely where they would have some opportunity to reveal their Christian commitments and identity and so on.
Well, and you know, Father, one of the endeavors that I'm involved in here, that I'm spearheading here, is a series of scholarly, academic, ecumenical dialogues on the traditional dogmatic claims, the loci of our systematic theology that still divide us, but sort of in the tradition of evangelicals and Catholics together, Richard John Neuhaus and Charles Colson. To me, that's a perennial endeavor. It's one that should never end until we're all in heaven together. It fulfills, it's our consistent attempt to fulfill the high priestly prayer of Christ in John 17. So I think having you on here as a Catholic priest is not, as a historian, to talk about the trends in higher education, the life of Father Hesburgh, but also as, this is sort of an exchange of spiritual goods, as I think it was Yves Congar who said that. I think John Paul II said something similar. That we continue to engage across the ecumenical aisle on any and everything that we really can unify under. And higher education in the service of Christ and his church, even though I know we would define church a little bit differently, but still in the service of Christ and the Great Commission, we are both obviously very dedicated to that noble goal.
Thank you, Anthony, for the opportunity for this conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. I hope some of your listeners may benefit from it in some way.
And like I said, we'll link to the book, and I would love to have you on another time, maybe to dig into some other issues of American history and Catholic life.
Be very glad to do it. God bless you, Anthony.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.